Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. After the lunch, the after lunch session is always hard to stay awake, but we really appreciate that you're here. Welcome to the session on Beyond Land Use and Land Use Change and towards biodiversity, all things biodiversity. We're going to be having 4 presentations today, and maybe we'll be able to finish a little bit earlier so that you can also take advantage of the multiple parallel sessions that are going on at the same time that are also really interesting. So we'll first have a presentation by America, then by Florian, then I'll be speaking, and then at the end we'll have Martin. So we're going to get started.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. My name is America, I'm a PhD student, and I'm going to present part of my PhD research, which is trying to identify biodiversity indicators of soil multifunctionality under the pressure of expanding export agriculture in central Mexico. So some of the main causes of expansion of export crops are encroaching foreign markets and the consumption demand. And some of the main consequences are deforestation, crop replacement, and land leasing and intensification. But as you can see, most of the consequences are measured or presented as the above ground of the problem. So what is happening with the below ground? We know that soil maintains so many ecosystem functions that are necessary for the overall maintenance of the ecosystem, like nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, water purification. It's also important for climate regulation and food supply. And all of these functions are driven by soil biota, and the maintenance of these functions and the simultaneously maintenance is called or based on a concept that is multifunctionality. So these functions driven by biota, but which one? So we know biodiversity is huge. So what can we use as biological indicators of functions? So is it species diversity? Is it functional diversity? What can be a good measure to evaluate this? So we know that species richness and species diversity is costly to measure not only in time but also in money. So some proposals are that functional diversity can be a good alternative. So you can see here some of the most common functional groups. Here I present some of the plant groups, and you will see here some groups that are not usually recognized because these are functions that the plants do to the soil. So we characterize these functional groups, like for example erosion control plants that have fine roots that can retain soil, plants that can translocate nutrients and water to the soil profile, that can be classified as the incidence area, like superficial or deep, plants that promote nutrient cycling, that are associated with microorganisms that can regulate biochemical cycles. And on the other hand, we have fauna that can be separated in functional groups that are reported to the soil, that are most common, like microregulators that are very important for for the decomposition cycle of the organic matter, soil engineers that can physically impact the soil, litter transformers that break down the plant material that accumulates over the soil, and some groups like pollinators and predators. And there are also microbiota that can be used and have functional relationships with the soil. So even if these are like more taxonomic classification, bacteria and fungi both are related with the decomposition, but in a different way. Fungi have the metabolic ability to decompose very recalcitrant organic matter. On the other hand, there are specialized fungi that make interactions with plants that can be very important in the nutrient exchange. And there are also fauna that can regulate populations. So among these groups, we know what they do, but we don't know how this expand of crops with the management that they include are modifying these communities. So we aim to identify the best biological indicators as predictors of soil functioning for the most common land covers in a region currently undergoing export crop expansions. So we did a study in 3 export crop covers, which are avocado, blueberry, and blackberry. An original non-export cover, which is annual cropping. It is mainly maize. And we use forest cover as a crop reference. And we wanted to find, we expected to find the lower multifunctionality and biodiversity in covers with more intensive management, which are mainly the export crop covers. And we wanted also to identify good predictors within the biological groups that I just mentioned. We did a study in 56 sites in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt in Michoacán, central Mexico, which is a mountain range with mild temperature weather, and subtropical pine oak forest. So as you can see, there are not the same number of sites per cover, and that's mainly because it is a very complex landscape. So we try to represent as much as the covers do themselves. And our assessment consists in develop a soil multifunctionality index. So we measure 7 soil functions through direct indicators of the soil, which are soil structuring, water retention, nutrient supply, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, population regulation, and plant growth promotion. And we also measure or assess soil diversity by functional groups of plant and soil fauna, mainly by morphotypes, and soil microbiota by fatty acid characterization. So we did a field sampling. We also conduct interviews to characterize management, which includes the main agronomic practices. And we took samples of the superficial mineral soil samples. So we run all of these analyses, and what we found is, based on the interviews information, is that management is different. So we found that even if there are groups that are, this is a ordination based on a cluster analysis, so even if they share most of the practices, management can separate this. Here are mainly the annual cropping and are characterized mostly by tillage and mechanic traffic. Here are most of the berry sites, and avocado and blueberry covers. They are shared because they are mainly characterized by high inputs of pesticides and fertilizers. So we expected this to be different among our soil functions and soil biodiversity. But what we found was that here you can see the evaluation of soil functions. These are flower diagrams, and the length of each petal means the maintenance of each function. So what you can see is that there are trade-offs and synergies in some functions, and this varies in every cover, but average, it was not so much difference in multifunctionality. So there are not so much different in functions, but what is happening with biodiversity. And we found that there was less variation in these groups. We found that mainly by plants with nutrient cycling promoter plants, and bacteria on the microbiota part are some indicators that can give us some insight as predictors because they had the most variation, so they separate the covers. Here you can see how can we use these functional groups as predictors or functions. So here are outputs of regression trees analysis. So each one of these is a regression tree, and you can see here all of the groups that we evaluated. So higher color intensity means that it can explain most of the variance. So over the plants, most functional groups were not good predictors. As I said earlier, nutrient cycling associated plants were the best ones, but as you can see, not for all the functions. So it's not that they give us a lot of information for all of them, but for some. From the fauna perspective, most of the functional groups were, it was the poorest predictors that we evaluate, but this output is not that they are not good predictors, but maybe because, and the next step for us is evaluate how management is affecting these groups, because maybe they are not giving us information because they are part of the ones that receive the damage. And finally, bacteria abundance were the best predictors of soil functioning. So I just wanted to finish to tell you that despite difference, there was no difference in multifunctionality. Plant, fauna, and bacteria show lower variation, and the best predictors of all were microbiota. That is important because they are often left behind in the evaluations. So that will be it.
All right, we have some time for questions, if anyone has any. Sorry.
Thank you, very interesting. Did you consider evaluating productivity in terms of the crop and how that's related to the soil traits that you were measuring?
Yeah, it was one of the soil functions that we evaluated as plant growth promotion, but we did that through a greenhouse experiment because that is a very difficult measure to get for the interviews or even in the field. So yes, we did that, and we used a model plant for that.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I come from the industry, oil and food ingredients, and we are really interested in getting biodiversity indicators into our matrix of assessment. So from your presentation, like my first clarification question will be, it seems you evaluated monocrop areas, right? So when you say plant and fauna diversity, do you mean non-target crops as well? So say if you have an avocado farm, do you also evaluate the other plants' diversity within it? That's my first question, because we work a lot with cocoa and coffee farmers where there's a lot of agroforestry, and one of the volume potential indicators is the diversity of other crops in there. And my second question would be, like, based on your experiment, what would you advise companies to assess? And this has to be like large-scale rollout, feasible, also in terms of economic investment. What would you advise a company to measure to get the best representation of soil multifunctionality with as little resources as possible?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. So we evaluated all of the diversity crops. I forgot to mention that, but we characterized all the plants that were there, not just the main crop. It was just because, avocado or cacti are very diverse. So we characterized by morphotypes, that it's not maybe the best resolution, and then we group that in functional characterization. So we did that, and it was different and it was different even from our chart to our chart. So it's a lot of variation that we did try to consider. And for the last question, that's it's a tricky one, because I could say that maybe microbiota could be a good indicator. It's both is sensitive but also resilient, so you can measure it through time. For example, fauna groups can disappear, but this one can stay in the soil. But it's you need more than one measure in time. So maybe that could be a good indicator. Our further analysis is to validate this, because we need to prove it and just not do it once, but in time.
Thank you, America. Florian. Or now we have Florian.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. I'm Florian. I'm presenting some work from Trace, based at Stockholm Environmental Institute in collaboration with Cambridge University. And we are, since long, trying to link biodiversity indicators to supply chains. And this has been an effort which wasn't very successful yet, just because biodiversity is so complex. But new biodiversity indicators allow us to make progress on this. And this is particularly important because more and more companies and countries commit to biodiversity targets, but then we don't really have ways to really measure progress or understand the impacts of individual companies to those biodiversity impacts. There's no single simple metric, and multiple perspectives can be useful. And even though I'm using two, there's like so many more, as we just heard. It's a very simple view of the biodiversity world, which I will be presenting to the supply chains. Often species range metrics have been used, and the ecosystem-related metrics suggested, and there has been a lot of development in those indicators recently. The research questions I'm asking here is, what are the biodiversity impacts linked to production and consumption of agricultural commodities, and how do priority regions and supply chain actors change when accounting for biodiversity compared to other indicators on land use change, such as soil commodity deforestation, which we regularly map for soy, for example, in Brazil. I will also, this small piece of work will also focus on soy in Brazil. I was promising more, but we didn't manage to work on more, but this is going to come hopefully after this presentation. I will be selected two metrics. One which was recently developed, the land-based impact on future extinctions live by Cambridge University, and the ecosystem integrity index. And I just want to give you a small introduction to those metrics. The land-based impacts on future extinctions is based on species area of habitats, including around 30,000 species, and incorporates the effects of historical habitat loss to estimate the non-linear effect of further habitat losses or restorations. With this, it quantifies the change in expected extinctions with each conversion of land. This is a global index calculated, and that's why it's really important to also look a little bit at the resolution. It's scalable at 500 meters to 1,000 kilometers, and it based on the reference year in 2016 around. And then I'm using the ecosystem integrity index, which is one metric to characterize the integrity of terrestrial ecosystems, and includes different components of ecosystems, such as the structure, the composition, and function, and provides an index linearly scaled between 0 and 1, with high levels of integrity being suggested to be have a value of larger than 0.7, but that's of course also a little bit arbitrary. Then this index is at a 1 by 1 kilometer square resolution, and it's also a global index, so can be applied for globally. What I do here is I really base this assessment on deforestation for soil. So it's not beyond deforestation, it's based on deforestation, which is a bit of a difference maybe. And then I calculate the change to expected species extinction caused by land conversions for each pixel and bring those two indicators together to understand the soil deforestation change to expected species extinctions. And then I use the trace data to link that to the supply chains, where we have like a good set of, where we model the trade relationships between soy production, soy traders, and importing countries based on trade records and shipments. And I do basically the same for the high integrity ecosystems, so this is just very similar. From here I want to come to the results, where I look at all of Brazil and compare how soil deforestation and those indicators have where they are high and how they compare. On the left-hand side, we have soil deforestation with like the typical high impact regions in the Mato Pipa region, and the Mato Grosso in the Amazon region, and then in the Pampas in the south. So that's also indicating that the soil deforestation or the deforestation definition includes all conversion of native vegetation, not only forest, but it is a very broad definition of deforestation I'm using here. And then on the right-hand side, it's the life index, and here we particularly see the Mato Pipa region highlighted as one of the high impact regions for species expected species extinctions, and then the Pampas region. And Mata Atlantica and Pampa. When we look at the total soil deforestation, it's around 880,000 hectares in 2023, which is resulting to a change in expected species extinctions based on the live data of 9 species. And we wanted to look a little bit at the hotspots, how those patterns change. Do we find additional regions which are not highlighted by soil deforestation but by species extinctions? And 90% of soil deforestation can be located in 10% of the municipalities, so it's really a small region where the impacts are on soil deforestation. And then for species extinction, it's 11% of the municipalities where most of the 90% of the extinction happens. On the right-hand side, I just have a pretty map where in red, it's those areas that overlap on those hotspots. In black, these are the areas where we have high extinctions happening, and in blue, where there's high deforestation but not high extinctions. And we see that those areas partly overlap, but there's also differences. So we see particularly in the Pantanal region over here, and in the Mata Atlantica, areas which are not highlighted by soil deforestation as much, but are really relevant for species conservation. And then when we go to the high ecosystem integrity areas, we see that there's different areas compared to the extinctions, where we see the Mato Pipa region and the Amazon region in Mato Grosso particularly highlighted. And again, when we look at the totals, we see we can calculate that 380,000 hectares of high integrity areas are lost, which is around 40% of the soil deforestation areas. Again, we can see the different hotspot overlaps and differences, and we can particularly see that in the Amazon region, there's a couple of regions which are not necessarily mapped by soil deforestation hotspots, but by high integrity area, loss of high integrity areas. But the overlap is much bigger than for species extinctions. From here, I wanted to go to the supply chains and link the actors exporting those commodities, and I highlighted the top 5 companies here, which export around, or like are exposed to around 44% of soil deforestation, and also similar amounts of species, expected change in species extinction and loss of high integrity areas. And what is important here is that those rankings change between companies. So, for example, COFCO here changes from the 2nd rank to the 5th rank, and then for species extinction risks to the 1st rank is like the highest exposed to species extinctions. We don't see such changes when we look at companies which import those commodities, where we have the top 5 country groups exposed to around 70% of each of those impacts, and China is just dominating the soy import so much that China is just the highest, has the highest footprint on those areas. And in conclusion, I wanted to summarize that hotspots areas of impact overlap, but there's also differences, and those indicators provide additional focus areas for conservation interventions. And also companies are differently exposed to those biodiversity impacts, and which provides additional guidance for conservations. Those data sets are global, and we want to expand those analyses across the commodities on Cote d'Ivoire and different countries and commodities. But of course, there's a lot of limitations linked to those data sets, which we still need to look and understand better, as this is only linked to land conversions, unable to focus on specific species, and also needs regular updates. Thanks.
All right, so once again, we have Karsten, and then in the back.
Hi, thanks a lot for the interesting talk. You had on one slide, you had a range of spatial resolutions where you deem an indicator reliable. Could you say what this is based on?
That's based on the paper by Alice and Iris, who did do an extensive analysis on this. I can't really go into detail, but they have tested this. Oh, of course, there are of course many other limitations to the data, such as that species ranges come from the IUCN red list, and then the land cover, the habitat areas are not.
So it might just be a wording, but like for a biogeographical modeler like me, this term reliable is really aching, because we know that not even the land cover information is reliable, that information, nor is the habitat association, nor is the species distribution, and you compound all these uncertainties. So it's
there's many uncertainties.
I don't know.
It's a wording thing mostly. I think I should have been more careful, and my co-authors should have advised me better.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really like that you showed 2 indices, and it's nice. We know about the uncertainties, so at least we can sort of do some validation with this. My question is on how you allocate the deforestation to soy in particular.
Yes, that's a bit specific about how Trace does this. We look at, we always allocate the soy, the deforestation methods linked to the exports of soy, and we look at 5 years of deforestation before the export year. So all deforestation which is happening on the pixel, which was classified as soy, within 5 years is characterized as deforestation for soy for that production year. So, yeah.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, just to clarify the same question. So there are no other major crops in the same area where soy is?
Oh, this one is really specific about soy deforestation. It's only linked to soy, what I've been presenting, not any other commodity. I could have done this for other commodities if we had good data on commodity production, but that's usually very limited as well and uncertain. So we use the soy maps and then deforestation from map biomas and PODES, and there's no good data on maize, for example, or cotton. It's very rare to find good data on crop-specific productions.
Thanks for the talk. I think you said you haven't managed to do another commodity or country, but will you be doing different commodities and countries, and which ones, and will that effectively be able to tell us how good a proxy or how big the range is in deforestation, meaning biodiversity loss? And will we also be able to differentiate the different groups, or different mammals or something, like when you do that, or will it just be a figure for anywhere in the globe as well?
That's a good question. Would be great to do all of this for as many commodities and countries as possible, but we really work on Cote d'Ivoire, cacao, soy and beef, Brazil, and palm oil in Indonesia, and that's the core commodities we will be working on with this as well. I think we will sadly stay as aggregated as this is at the moment. We won't really have the capacity to look at different species, and there have been previously multiple studies looking at different species for all of those commodities. But we hope to update this on a regular basis, and then we can't look at too many individual issues, I think. Thank you very much.
And now it's my turn. Pointer. All right. So now I'm going to be talking about who owns Brazil's biodiversity, somewhat of a big title. And I'm going to start with biodiversity, and which is really at the core of what this session is trying to do, right? Why do we care about what happens with biodiversity? I don't think I need to preach to the choir and talk too much or too in depth about the biodiversity crisis, but we are in one, and species populations are declining at an alarming rate. And we know, on the one hand, that this is primarily due to anthropogenic drivers that result in land use change and resulting habitat loss, and these are typically associated to agriculture in the tropics. And so one of these underlying or indirect drivers behind this change that is often talked about is land tenure. And this is because land tenure governs who owns what land and what they can do with it. And so this naturally includes the use of natural resources, right? And at the same time, within the world of land tenure, there's a lot of myths around this. So for instance, there's this really often cited figure that 80% of the world's lands are in indigenous lands. And that's simply not quite true, as pointed out by this recent comment that came out this year in Nature. Whereas this came from a study that was just cited over and over again, it's more true that at least around 30% 37% of indigenous people's lands are in natural lands or lands with very low levels of ecological disturbance. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, measuring biodiversity is hard. And it's complex because it's multidimensional. It involves things from genetic diversity, it involves lots of details, as we heard in America's presentation, it involves species and ecosystems. So how have we approached this? Here, we've started by modeling potential biodiversity work that has been spearheaded by the Center for Remote Sensing at the UFMG in Brazil. Britaldo and some of his lab members are around, so please chat with them if you ever get a chance. They're great. And with them, we have done this pairing of environmental data, which includes vegetation indices, as well as canopy height to get at structure, climatic, soil, topographical variables, and we've paired these with species occurrences and habitat preferences data, which includes over 2 million records of all these plant and animal species. And by pairing these data, we are able to sort of model this one layer of current biodiversity, which is approximately tries to approximate biodiversity around the year 2020, and also a baseline of biodiversity so that we have a comparison to current biodiversity patterns. And this is a bit atemporal in the sense that it's not belonging to a specific year, but it is referring to a scenario where there was no anthropogenic disturbance. And so this is what this looks like for current biodiversity around 2020. We have species richness, which is essentially the number of species in a grid cell, ranging from around 400 to over 1,200 species in Brazil. We see the usual suspects in terms of region with high numbers of species, and as well as we include the indicator for species endemism, which endemism is essentially a measure of how rare species are. And here we also see endemism is quite high in the south. And we compare this current biodiversity, as I was saying before, to this baseline, and we subtract the baseline from it to try and arrive at these maps of decreases in potential biodiversity. And this is what these look like. So here we see the lighter areas seeing highest declines. And just to make a very quick comparison, this is what deforestation looks like for the longest time period that we had data available for 1985 to 2023. And we already see of course, these two things are correlated, right? But we already do see some differences, particularly as we see these high declines in the south. And on the other hand, we've also done a compilation of land tenure data, which we've updated. This includes undesignated public lands, which are lands belonging to the state, but under no formal designation, rural settlements, which are also belonging to the state, but don't have a formal title, private lands, both categories of protected areas, and indigenous lands, and quilombola lands, which are lands belonging to communities of descendants from African slaves in Brazil. This is what this map looks like. But to get at what this looks like when we pair these data, so here, this is just very simple box plots of the distribution of these declines in potential diversity, so decreases in richness per kilometer square per each of the properties under each of these tenure categories. Here we see that on average, there were on average larger decreases in species richness per kilometer square per property in private lands as compared to all these other tenure categories. And this is very similar for endemism. Whereas, on the other hand, if we compare this to deforestation, this is a bit more ambiguous because we know that a lot of deforestation occurred also in these undesignated lands and rural settlements. And when we repeat the exercise for current biodiversity, so the biodiversity that we currently have, we see something quite similar as well, where most, on average, private lands have a, per square kilometer in their properties, higher species richness than these tenure categories. And I'm going to focus more on the current biodiversity because I think it's it has very interesting for conservation implications. And so we see something very similar for endemism. Albeit it's a bit harder to interpret because this is just an index value right here at the bottom. And then again, when we compare this with a current forest cover, which is essentially everything that's in green, right, just the green, while we have a pretty high forest cover in all these conservation lands of protected areas and indigenous lands, close on average 100% forest cover, this is much more between, on average, right, from like 30% to 50% in these private lands, in rural settlements, followed by undesignated lands and quilombola lands. And so, as I was saying, I want to focus on this current biodiversity. As we think about potential restoration priorities through fuller compliance with the forest code in Brazil. And I'm very lucky, I don't have to talk too much about these details of the forest code in Brazil because we heard about it in the plenary yesterday. But if you might remember, in Brazil, the forest code requires properties to maintain certain percentages of their land under natural vegetation. And this paper identified the deficit in this vegetation that is owed per property. And so this is what this looks like updated to the year 2023. And where again we see that it's really a handful of properties that owe these vast amounts of land to be either to be restored to native vegetation, shown in the darkest areas of brown, which maybe are not showing up that great on the screen, but they're around here, and these huge areas. And so we thought, what would this imply for if we were to think about this through the lens of biodiversity? And here we see a map of potential restoration under fuller compliance with the forest code. If all of these properties were to fully comply with the forest code, this is where we could see potential increases. And I think what I mainly want to highlight is that we see increases in potential richness all throughout regions in Brazil, right? And the reason that I want to talk about that is because I really think that engaging, well, of course, indigenous lands and maintaining protections for protected areas as well as indigenous lands is incredibly important. It's also incredibly important to be working with and engaging with private landholders for both protection and restoration in Brazil. And this is, of course, work in progress. And so I think it really highlights pretty well the need to think through when we're using land use proxies and when we actually do need to go further and think about these biodiversity metrics, as many private sector commitments are starting to try to do. And to conclude, if you're interested in all things biodiversity, please get in touch. We've been trying to put together a working group at Unibon, where I am. We're looking for papers that do impact evaluation using biodiversity-specific metrics. So I would love to chat. Please get in touch. Thank you to all of my collaborators who are behind a lot of the data that I've presented today. And I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thanks for that talk. It was really interesting. I do not know of papers that use impact evaluation on biodiversity matrices, but on biodiversity metrics. But I was wondering, kind of theoretically, does it even make sense? It doesn't really come down to your talk, I guess, but if nobody else has other questions, I would like to understand more around how would you justify doing a causal impact evaluation on biodiversity metrics, because they are so different from space to space, and to try and approximate them seems very does not conform to reality, I think.
It's tricky for sure. But I do think, so first of all, great to meet you. We should chat. I'm a big fan of your papers. I just recognized your name. I think that's an excellent question. I do think that we need to operationalize when like full impact evaluation needs to happen and when it doesn't. And I think that there's a very tricky gray space in between that I think we need to like take a step back and operationalize, because there is a lot of opportunity for greenwashing, for instance, and people are already trying to do lots of things like within the space of biodiversity offsets and all sorts of other, because this is even just the private sector, we're not even talking about the public sector, right? And so, yes, I think that there are instances where it could work, right? Where it does make sense, because impact evaluation is not always about comparing, not necessarily comparing biodiversity across different sites, for instance, but you could be comparing biodiversity before and after, right? Which is actually like the backbone of good impact evaluation, something that's before and after, and where you have a good basis for a counterfactual, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. No, I think we should check.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for the talk. I'm just curious to know, maybe it's because I missed the beginning of the talk, but how do you measure exactly the biodiversity benefits of restoration or the reduction of endemism, if it's just the inverse of the negative impacts from deforestation, or if you calculate them differently?
For now, it is simply that, right? But it's just been the first step.
And you think the models will be able to estimate?
I think we could make them a lot more sophisticated, right? Because we could think about all sorts of management and in which ways it would be more constrained and which places. I think that the prioritization conversation in conservation is also tricky, right? But I think what I mostly want to highlight is that it happens everywhere, and it happens with not necessarily in these huge private properties, but actually with lots of medium properties all throughout Cerrado, throughout the south. So I think that's where I would be more interested in getting our potential restoration right? Okay, and we work together, so. All right, well, if there are no further questions, I will give the word to Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm now having the honor of opening the box of life cycle assessment. So then probably many of you are like, what is life cycle assessment? It's a decision support tool for sustainability assessment. And what does it do? It attributes environmental impacts to products. And more specifically, it can look at impacts on ecosystem quality, on human health, and also natural resources. And as the name says, it's really a life cycle assessment perspective. So it really goes from the mineral extraction over the use phase until the end of life of this product. And what can we use this tool for? It's really important for me to point out it's used for a relative comparison. So I would like to find out which is the better product, but I cannot say what is a good product. And since we're dealing with these global supply chains, it's really important that we have models with global coverage. And also if I would like to find out what is happening here, these models need to be stressor specific. In the end, I would like to know where's the impact coming from, not one lumped together impact in the end. So then the big question is, how do I now perform an LCA? So the first question that I have to ask myself then is, what would I like to compare? And for this talk, I decided that we're going to look at 1 kilogram of white rice cooked and consumed in USA, Switzerland, India, and China. So this really means then we're looking at the production itself, then the processing, the distribution, and in the end, the cooking. And why is it now USA, Switzerland? This is because in India and China, the rice is grown in the same country, while there is no rice grown in Switzerland, so there the rice is coming from the USA. And then we have now a lot of sub-processes that you can see here. It's not really important which ones these are, but there's many of them, and we would like to consider all of them. And for these, now we need to get the emissions and the resources used during these processes. And these ones we're then collecting in a long list in a database, and this is what is then called the life cycle inventory. So we have land use flows, it can be greenhouse gas emissions, but it can also be, for example, phosphorus and nitrogen, and maybe also some radioactive substances coming from the electricity that is used. So in total, I would then get, for the case of rice, almost 3,000 flows. So it's a huge list, and for the sake of this presentation, I would like to cut it a bit down. And now then the big question is, what do we now next with this list? What we now would like to do is we would like to quantify the impact in the so-called life cycle impact assessment stage. And therefore we need characterization factors, and they are assessing the impact in per unit inventory, in this case maybe a square meter per arable land. And if I now multiply the inventory with a characterization factor, then I will get my impact, and I can then sum the impact up for all the land use classes in this case. So now the question for you maybe is then, fitting with this session, what is the impact indicator that we're using in life cycle impact assessment? And the impact indicator of choice is the so-called potentially disappeared fraction of species. So it's a measure of species richness, and it's a unitless factor between 0 and 1, and it's relative to the species present in the area. So then, now we know the indicator, but now how do we get to a characterization factor calculation? What LCA really loves is relationships. So to get this characterization factor, we need a relationship between the impact and the stressor, and for land use, the relationship of choice is the species-air relationship. It's coming from island theory, and here we have Sri Lanka and Madagascar, and now Sri Lanka is a smaller island than Madagascar, and the species-air relationship assumes a positive relation between size. So in this case, I would expect more species in Madagascar than in Sri Lanka. And from an impact modeler perspective, I can now take this positive relationship and turn it around and say, well, now if I have a habitat loss, I can also calculate the species loss. And what I'm showing here is the so-called classic species-air relationship, and it has the limitation that it only considers natural habitat. So we see here that there are some limitations to this method. So this is why there have been lots of developments going on in the field, and the most advanced one that we're currently having is this so-called species-habitat relationship. The first improvement is that it can also look at human-modified habitats, not only natural land. And for example, it's considering that the fox can survive in urban areas. And also many birds can live. We see it here in the city that there can be birds. And in addition to this, it's not only looking at the land use change, but also at the habitat fragmentation. And how does it do this? It considers patch size, it considers the distance between the patches, and also the dispersal ability of species. So to give you an example how this is working, I have here back to Sri Lanka and one ecoregion. And if we now zoom in, we see the different land use types. And the first thing that we have to do is now create these patches. So a simple group rasters of same land use types. And now we would like to find out, can the species really move to the next patch of the same type? So there we really have to consider this, and it's really computational power that you need to do it, because this is now, for one species, you have to do it for many species, and also here we're only looking at 2 patches, and then we can do this with all the combinations of the patches. So this is why the script, if you have it, it's running for weeks, so it's really a sophisticated model behind it. And what do we then get out? We get characterization factors for 5 land use types, 3 intensity levels, 5 species groups, and then this native spatial resolution of these characterization factors is ecoregions, and in the end we have more than 60,000 characterization factors. And how does now the result look of an LCA if we look at land use? This is how it is. We have now our 3 country cases, and an LCA would now look at the ranking. So I would like to try to find the one with the lowest impact, and in this case then China would get the rank 1, and then we would conclude that producing rice in China has the lowest impact. But now it's a question, can we really conclude based on this result? I would say if I'm asking like this, no. Because for me also, PDF, species richness, is only looking at the intrinsic value. What is now the instrumental value? So there's lots of more aspects to it. And to solve this, it has been decided to also look at ecosystem services in LCA. And these factors, they're now really new because they're available since 3 weeks. They have been published from the UN Environment GLAM Life Cycle Initiative. And what do? They look at land occupation, 58 land use types. Then they look on an impact on soil, maybe a soil loss or a soil degradation. How is this then impacting the ecosystem processes? Maybe we're losing some filtration or even the soil itself. And then this has a cost for humans that we have to compensate for, maybe that we need some new water supply or other factors. And out of this, they then calculate characterization factors for 4 impact categories in total. And what is their choice of indicator? It's now dollars. So we're back to a monetary value, and then the characterization factors are dollars per square meter. How do now look the new results? So now we can add this. So now we see that the picture is getting a bit more complicated. And now suddenly if we think about now maybe Switzerland, that was now ranked 2nd here. Now if we look at erosion, it's suddenly ranked 1st, while it would be ranked 3rd here for the groundwater regeneration. So we now see adding new things is maybe changing the conclusion, and it ultimately then also depends on what do I want to prioritize. This is then a question that the stakeholder policymaker has to decide. And can we conclude? Can we yet conclude what is best? I would say still no, because if we go back to the PDF, there's a lot of more aspects to biodiversity than just species richness. So there has been a paper published in saying we need more indicators, and one of the indicators that we should develop is functional diversity. There has been a proposed framework for it, and they have chosen a really nice tongue breaker for the indicator. It's the potentially distributed fraction of functional diversity, PDF-FD, and that they suggest to look at functional richness, functional evenness, and functional divergence. And as this is now really data demanding, since they need abundance and trade data, we only have characterization factors for Germany and 3 land use types. So it's on its way, but it's not there yet. So more to come, but therefore another indicator is maybe even more promising. It's also looking at mean species abundance, life cycle assessment, and there is something which I call the Global approach from the Bamboo project, which is a sister project of the Rainforest project that I'm working in. And they're going to look at terrestrial species, more specifically birds and mammals, and they will have 4 impact categories for the characterization factors: land use, climate change, nitrogen deposition, roads, which they mean habitat fragmentation with. And the nice thing about the Global approach is that they can also look in the future, because they have climate change scenarios and land use scenarios, so there might be also characterization factors looking into the future. But this work is still ongoing, so I can't really show you any results for now, because it has to come. So we need more characterization factors in life cycle assessment, and if we have them, it's highly likely that our conclusion that we're going to get is going to change. But now it's for me the big but. We need to go beyond land use, and LCA already has the power to do that, because for now I was really focusing on land use impacts. How is it now looking if we do a full LCA using all its power and looking at all the impact categories where we have characterization factors for? So this is the complete picture. And now we see here it's land use in the middle, and then I can, for example, now compare it to climate change, where everyone is talking about. So we see that the land use impact is much higher than the climate change impact. But at the same time, if we now only look at land use, I would say we overlook totally the water consumption impact of rice. So can we really conclude on land use? And if we go now even further, I told you we can also look at impacts from human health. There we now suddenly see climate change is a huge contributor, but it's also fine particulate matter formation that has an impact on human health. So this is why we need more characterization factors, but if we want to solve the triple planetary crisis or avoid problem shifting and maybe trade-offs, we have to go beyond land use, and life cycle assessment is one option in doing that. With this, I would like to thank you. I see. Yeah, I can also send you the presentation. Then
All right.
if you
Or was it you that was first? Or
Thank you. That was a lot of really interesting information. I was thinking about this morning and the need for science to speak to policy and to have like a two-liner. And with your abundance of information, do we need to compile that into something that's simplified? Do you need a single indicator instead of many, many, many?
So what I haven't explained is, since it's now the same indicator, I can in theory add them up, right? Then I get one value for ecosystem quality, one for human health, and one for ecosystem services. And then there's two other optional steps, like normalization and weighting, and then I could get them to a single score. So it's possible, but of course, then you lose like level of detail. Then I can only show you, well, China is lowest, and maybe Switzerland is highest, and then you ask the question why, and then we can dig back into this. But the framework itself offers to go to one single score for each country.
I think I saw Carsten and then in the back and then Justin.
Hi, thanks a lot. Super interesting. So the one thing I always wonder about life cycle assessments, it's all about adding detail, right? Being very comprehensive yet very detailed. Now, for any model, I would expect that as you add more process detail, your systemic bias decreases because you have a better representation of the system, but your measurement bias will increase because more and more processes in the model are not actually well parameterized for every single species. So what's your assessment of what's sort of the optimal level of this trade-off between, you know, complexity and I guess realism and accuracy?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I think we're a bit back to what is the tool used for, right? It's in the end for relative comparison, and it's also in the ideal case. I mean, if you put your scope, it definitely has to be the same scope. So can we really get this data? And also, we may increase uncertainty, but if we now look at these results here, is it then really changing the ranking, right? If I'm anyway in the impact category, which is really low, and if I'm now increasing the uncertainty in this one, it's kind of the question, will it change my overall conclusion? So that's also a bit the question there, do I really need to do this? And then there's lots of work and also like the spatial level of the inventory data, where is it produced, and that there's some autocorrelation, and they have shown that it's maybe not the best idea to go on the smallest level detail as possible, because then you have too much correlation between the processes. So then they recommended to go a step up and not go to the smallest. But for now, I still see that there is lots of data missing about the processing. So for now, at least, I normally have a lack of data in getting to the impact instead of having to deal with uncertainty issues.
Thank you for your talk, and well done for summarizing all of that in such a short time. It was interesting to hear about the ecosystem services introduction into life cycle assessment, but it also, I know there's limitations to all of the characterization factors, but it also worries me a bit to introduce something that's based on an economic valuation of those different factors in dollars or whatever it is. And I was wondering if you'd reflected on or have any comment on the biases that might introduce from how those valuations are determined. So if you're to switch PDF being a more like measured natural factor to something that's involved in economic valuation, which can have problems and biases in so many different ways. If you had any thoughts on that, thanks.
I mean, the first point for me, it's like in addition, right? It's then a question. It's not meant to replace the PDF. It should always be seen side by side. And then there's a question for you, do you want to consider it or not? Because I also see that there's many LCA studies where they now convert PDF into $1 by simply doing any multiplication. So there is a political need for it. But then, these characterization factors in this GLAM project, there have been to a lot of stakeholder consultation and feedback. And there has been criticism, and my summary would be it's a good starting point. We have seen for the land use, there has been a development over 10, 12 years. So we should give also the ecosystem services a bit of time to develop, but you see that the practitioners are demanding for the factors, so it's like a strange balance to find between being scientifically accurate while delivering on time that it's used for decision making, because decision making is happening right now, and if we say, well, ecosystem services characterization factors coming in 15 years, then they will say, well, yeah, okay. So it's this trade-off, but yeah, there has been a process behind it, and I think it's not the last set of ecosystem services characterization factors that we have seen.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I've never thought about life cycle assessment applied to crops before. I had a few questions, two questions. One was around yield, not yield, varieties, like different rice varieties. Do they not have possibly different impacts, and how they are grown? That was the first question. Like, how would you consider that? And the other was around, what about cultural services, or kind of, the way people relate to rice-grown landscapes in different places, where in China there's a long history of rice cultivation, so that kind of more intangible values. How would you incorporate them into life cycle assessment? Thank you.
Yes, so with the rice production, of course, I've chosen now this white rice, and it's also then the question of how much data do we have about the production. I also had brown rice, but also if you think about yield and then all these things, you could include them in kind of rephrasing your question of what am I going to compare. So there's no limitation as long as you have the data availability. And for the ecosystem services, the cultural perspective, there is more characterization factor developments going on, which are also trying to capture more aspects. But this is like, the most comprehensive set which is published that I've presented today. But there's, in the future there will be more impact categories coming. But I still think I haven't answered your first question. I have to say it depends, but normally it's supposed to be spatially explicit. So it can be the land use map, or that you get some FAO data, or for the cultural service, I know we look at beach plastic, so this is also really local, and then I have done a survey, what is the willingness to pay in these countries. So yes, there's some spatial detail to it, but if we now would dig behind all these characterization factors, the level of detail is different. So it's as the lowest scale possible, I would say. It's a practical modeler's choice, but of course if there's new data coming, you can always change the...
One last question maybe?
Thanks a lot. I come from industry, so I mean these kind of tools are very useful when you, as a company that is a bit downstream the value chain, wants to take a decision of changing whether I source rice from China or India, right? But for a company that is more upstream, like Olam, the company I work for, where land use change is such a very tangible impact because we deal with farmers day to day. How will you convince such a company to use life cycle assessment? Because when you say it is spatial explicit, you mean countries and land use types mostly, right? So we are not talking about pixel specific. So, and if you have farm locations, you do need that level of granularity. So if I have a choice of using life cycle assessment in PDF versus using other tools that have been presenting all over the conference as well, right? Like ecosystem assessments, etc. Why should I choose LCA?
Yes, if you're asking about the spatial detail, actually all the utification ones, they are at pixel level. And what I can tell you is, what I see is that the industry tells me the pixel level is too detailed, they can't deal with it. So it's a bit the opposite direction, because also then you need to know the production data. So I've experienced the other way around, and I would say why should you use this tool? It's really because of its completeness, like how much can you cover, and that it's harmonized between the impact categories so that you can do this cross comparison, right? If we talk about the triple planetary crisis, it doesn't help me if I have a good tool for climate change and then I use another tool for biodiversity, then I have something there, and then for pollution I take another one, where is this coming from? So the strength really here lies in being comprehensive. And of course with the land use it's at ecoregion level now, but why is this? This is because we have no data about how can species survive in all these 80 human modified land use types. It's hard to model how many species will live in a mineral extraction site compared to the natural habitat. But if the data is coming, it will be there. So it's a bit of a question. Maybe it's also if industry says you need this, if there's funding for it. I quite often see that, yeah, people ask for the characterization factors. Why haven't you done them yet? Because there was also not the need for. And then also for industries, it's, for example, in Europe, it's in the policy that you should use it. It's coming for reporting.
Yeah, just to say that there are different type of industry players, and I think that's the key difference, right? Like the most powerful actors are those are very close to the consumer facing, and they need this level, right? But they depend on decisions on where to source from companies like Olam that are really on the ground, and we really need to know where exactly in the landscape. And there you need spatial explicit. So we also need it.
Yeah, to maybe answer even differently, I would say I would never base any decision completely on life cycle assessment. It's like for relative comparison, it gives you a general idea, and then you can maybe use the second tool that you maybe have in your company where you have the level of detail, but it gives you an idea in which country is it maybe happening, and then you can dig a bit deeper in this area.
Well, maybe an excellent point to sort of conclude our session on. Thank you, Martin. Or we can, thank you, Martin. Yeah, but I think also an excellent example, because as we move towards biodiversity, which is not necessarily, which is, yes, a research frontier, but also one with a lot of decades of research behind it, and still huge data gaps, yet requirements from the policy side as well as from the private sector moving towards traceability. It's a whole big batch of complicated can of worms. Thank you again very much for being here. We'll give you a chance to go to any of the parallel sessions that are ongoing. And thank you to our speakers. See you around.